Today, we are going to be looking at what is going on in eastern Ukraine, and specifically how Russia has slowly marched east to west over the last year or so, and what Ukraine could be doing to improve that situation. It will be a little bit different from what you're used to. It's going to follow more of a conversational podcast form, where I go through each of the different mechanisms to explain what's happening there, and again, what Ukraine could be doing to improve the situation. And all of this, I think, is especially important given that we might be transitioning to a time when Russia and Ukraine are going to be negotiating a ceasefire as demanded by the Trump administration. Well, specifically today, there are 10 mechanisms I want to look at: Russian recruitment, Ukrainian Ukrainian training, defense allocations, Russian redeployment, Ukrainian rotations, tree lines, Ukrainian fortifications, an ammo discrepancy, and the Kursk offensive. While this is a podcast format without the traditional animations that I have in videos, there are two visuals that I think help us better understand exactly what's going on. First, I want to look at just the overall exchange of territory. So what you see here are 200 square kilometer increments. The white line in the right side of the screen represents no changes month to month, and if we have changes going to the left, that is the amount of territory that Russia has gained for that particular month, if it was a net positive for Russia. And if we have territory going to the right, that is an increase in net territory for Ukraine for that particular month. Overall, there are 4 phases that I think are important to today's story. First is the Ukrainian offensive from 2023, where we do see Ukraine making some small amounts of gains. Tends not to be all that much. The peak was June 2023, still under 200 square kilometers for that particular month. But the trajectory for Ukraine was looking good, at least as compared to what we're going to be seeing for the rest of this. Well, actually, part of the problems that we're going to be seeing in a moment are a consequence of what we're seeing right here with Ukrainian gains in 2023. But we'll get to that in a moment. The next phase is the last 2 months of 2023 and the early parts of 2024, when Russia starts to go on its offensive. And during that period of time, it actually wasn't all that big of a concern. There were Russian gains, sure, but at least during this initial part of the offensive, it wasn't all that concerning. And indeed, if you compare it to what we just saw here, the gains that Ukraine was making during its offensive looked stronger, if again, still relatively small in the grand scheme of things, as compared to what Russia was getting during this part of the offensive. But this part of the offensive was not the only part of the offensive. Where things started to become concerning for the West was what we might think of, at least for now, as the middle phase of the Russian offensive. May brought the first reasonable spike, and this was due to an offensive coming north to south from Russia into the Kharkiv Oblast, appearing to target Kharkiv city, but never quite getting close enough to the city to cause a serious concern. Nevertheless, the worry was still there that if those gains were to continue, then Kharkiv would be under threat for the first time since the opening months of the war. The upshot for Ukraine is that Russia was taking advantage of a lack of fortifications at that particular point, due to Ukraine believing that Russia would not try that particular tactic. But given that Russia did decide to do that, Russia took some casualties to take some territory, but Ukraine indeed was able to cut that off. And you can see in June 2024, there once again was not that much in terms of a gain for Russia. However, things picked back up in July, and that transitions us to the current phase of the offensive, where we can see now that Russia has made some reasonable gains over the last 6 months. Actually, this is where things started to get concerning for Ukraine, as going from July to August on your screen, then September, October, and November, we saw increases in each month of gains for Russia. Well, that slowed down a bit heading into December, and while there was an increase month to month from December 2024 to January 2025, both of those months remain below the amount of territory that Russia gained back in September of 2024. As it stands, we are unsure about whether the last 2 months of drop-off have been a consequence of Russia hitting harder areas to attack, or Ukraine getting better at defending this particular area of Ukraine, or maybe it's just because of winter weather making things a little bit more difficult. and we'll talk about some mechanisms for that later on in this video. There are also many questions about the amount of casualties that Russia has suffered over this period of time and how sustainable that will be, which will also feed into the conversation for later. And none of this takes into account the amount of territory that Russia has lost in Kursk. All of these figures, from the beginning of the offensive from Ukraine in 2023 all the way to today in 2025, we're only looking at Ukrainian territory gained back or lost, nothing that's going on in Russia. Nevertheless, what we're looking at is a difficult period of the war for Ukraine, and indeed perhaps the most difficult part of the war since the initial invasion began. One other visual will help set the stage for what we're going to be seeing later. This is the worst part of the territory lost for Ukraine. We're looking at Donetsk Oblast on your screen right now, with Donetsk City in the bottom right and Pokrovsk in the top left. Here's what the land looked like in terms of territorial control back in January of 2024. At that time, you might remember that the focus was on Avdiivka, the area under Ukrainian control that looks like it's about to be enveloped. Well, indeed it was, and so much so that we haven't really thought about Avdiivka in a long time at this point. Fast forward to February 10th, 2025, and that is what the territorial control looks like now. Notably, Russia has not yet made it to Pokrovsk proper. That's been the target for the last, say, 6 months or so. So if there is any sort of silver lining here for Ukraine, is that Pokrovsk still holds, much like Bakhmut held for a long period of time, even as it was looking particularly hairy for Ukraine. But things still are not going particularly well for Ukraine, which is why I want to go through those 10 mechanisms. And like I said, this is going to be more of a conversation than a traditional scripted video. So for the next period of time, I'm going to go through each one of these individually and just have an unscripted conversation with you about what that mechanism is, why it's causing a problem or has caused a problem for Ukraine, and perhaps what Ukraine can do to try to make things better in that light. Let's begin with Russian recruitment. And if you are watching a Lines on Maps Extra channel, you probably know the general trajectory of what has gone on here. The war began with essentially the troops that Russia had lying around. But when Ukraine had success in its counteroffensives in the fall of 2022, the Kremlin realized that it needed more bodies in order to be able to stem the tide, and perhaps progress even further into Ukraine. That's when we had the mobilization, which did not go over particularly well from a political perspective in the Kremlin, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and basically anywhere else of political importance inside of Russia. As a result, we have seen a transition to voluntary recruitment, which has been the status quo for more than 2 years now. This is where the Kremlin pays a competitive wage to individuals to convince those individuals to go over to Ukraine. That requires quite a bit of a risk premium, so this isn't cheap, it's expensive, but it's more politically popular because no one is being sent to Ukraine anymore against their will. The reason that this is necessary, of course, is the high level of casualties that Russia has been suffering along this front. Obviously, we don't have exact figures on that sort of thing, but more than 1,000 casualties per day is not a bad guess. Remember here, casualties not only mean fatalities, but it also includes wounded, missing in action, and perhaps prisoners of war as well. Even if some of those wounded can be patched up and sent back to the front line, you need to have a lot of warm bodies to keep this progress going. And in order to have those bodies, you have to keep hitting recruitment targets month after month after month. And again, so far, it seems like Russia is succeeding with that. Now, at the risk of saying something obvious, the solution from Ukraine's perspective is to simply cause more casualties. The mechanism by which this has the effect that Ukraine wants, though, is a little bit more layered. It's not just that you're having more people being injured or killed, which is preventing them from physically taking the territory. It's also causing second-order problems with recruitment. It's not the case that Russia has an endless stream of humans who could be sent to the front lines. Obviously, Russia has a very large population, a population much larger than Ukraine does. And thus, the overall of what you might think of as potential recruits inside of Russia is going to vastly outstrip the number of potential recruits inside of Ukraine. That should not be the focus, though. War is politics by other means, and for the war to continue going, the political actors inside of the Kremlin have to think that it is a good idea to continue. And specifically, if we're going to have a lot of bodies being sent to the front line to commit attacks which are going to result in more casualties, the political will to pay for all of those individuals to go out there needs to continue for this to work out properly. The way that this helps out Ukraine has two layers, an obvious one and a less obvious one. Let's start with the obvious one. If every soldier lost in Ukraine has to be replaced by a fresh soldier from Russia, then the Kremlin is going to have to pay a new contract every single time there is a casualty. The less obvious step of this is that when you are recruiting soldiers, the people that are most inclined to become soldiers are going to be the first ones who sign up, which means that they are the cheapest soldiers to recruit. So the deeper that the Kremlin has to go into this pool, the more that they are going to have to pay to convince the next soldier to sign up. Which means from Ukraine's perspective, every time a soldier is lost for Russia inside of Ukraine, the amount that Russia has to pay is going to increase, and perhaps increase exponentially, as you keep getting deeper into the casualty counts. Then there's also the possibility that the more casualties Ukraine racks up on the Russian side, the greater the signal that sends to would-be recruits inside of Russia that if they sign up, they are much more likely to be dismembered or lose their lives entirely if they go now, as compared to what their expectations may have been a year ago. Which means, from the Kremlin's perspective, the Kremlin will have to pay an even larger risk premium to those individuals for those individuals to be willing to make that sacrifice, perhaps for the betterment of their families. Now, the upshot for Kyiv here is that this seems to be one of the things that Ukraine has been doing well over the course of the last year or so. That what Ukraine has essentially been doing is trading territory for lives lost on the Russian side, hoping to impose those sorts of costs on the Kremlin, and maybe have some sort of second-order political benefits that come out of that. The problem for Ukraine, though, is that there are questions about what exactly the political upshot is. The Kremlin is not going to be experiencing any sort of marches on Moscow, at least not anytime soon. As long as there is voluntary recruitment, no one inside of Russia is being forced to go to the front lines. And so, as a result, if there's going to be an upswell of anti-war sentiment from the population as a whole, it's going to have to be through some sort of weird second-order mechanism where it's individuals within families not being paid out their war benefits, or the soldiers' contracts being forcibly renewed once they get there, or something to that effect, that actually gets large-scale populations inside of Russia to be upset enough to risk their own livelihoods by marching on the streets inside of Moscow. Rather, the main concern for the Kremlin right now should be the political threat of a coup coming from oligarchs who are upset about all of the economic distortions that this war has imposed upon them. They're the ones who are largely going to be paying those contracts to the soldiers implicitly through taxation. They are the primary ones who are suffering from the lack of trade with the West due to the West's economic sanctions imposed on Russia, and they also suffer from the inflationary effects of those contracts. We've talked about this a ton, but when the Ministry of Defense is paying large contracts to Ukrainian soldiers, that is increasing the wages that everyone inside of the Russian labor market is making. That's because employers need to be competitive with those Ministry of Defense contracts to keep some number of employees around. The best way to do that, of course, is to increase wages. They don't need to increase wages to match what the Ministry of Defense is offering, because the Ministry of Defense has to offer that risk premium. They're the ones that are going to die, not the people working inside of factories. But the consequence of all of this is increased wages and thus increased inflation. And indeed, Ministry of Defense contracts to produce tanks and other sorts of material for the war is further distorting economic incentives, and less stuff is being produced domestically inside of Russia that normal consumers want to actually purchase, which has further inflationary effects. And we know that the Russian central bank's way of trying to solve this sort of problem is the standard sort of way that any central bank would try to solve the problem, which is to increase interest rates. But that quashes the returns on investments, which is something that is very upsetting and frustrating to oligarchs, which could then result in some sort of coup threat against Putin. The problem for Ukraine, though, is that this isn't a way necessarily to win the war and force Russia to leave all of the territory that Russia has gained so far. That is a lot to ask for. And what is more likely to happen here instead is that the recruitment becomes so expensive for the Kremlin that the Kremlin decides that it is no longer capable of continuing to have this pace of offensive, and perhaps instead installs a defensive line to try to hold on to the gains that Russia has made so far. At that point, it will become significantly more difficult for Ukraine to impose casualties on Russia, which means that Russia will be able to recruit perhaps at replacement levels, and you get a freezing of the front lines as a consequence. Okay, let's move on to the other half of that same coin, which is now Ukrainian recruitment. This was one of Ukraine's main advantages at the beginning of the war. There was an upswell of Ukrainian national sentiment to try to beat back Russian forces that were invading. And so everyone was volunteering, people on the streets were being handed rifles to go shoot Russian soldiers that were incoming, and you had a large-scale set of forces that were capable of perhaps defending the country. That sentiment continued through the fall of 2022, and Ukraine's counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, where Russia rapidly lost territory, much more quickly than anything that we've seen over the last year plus. However, Ukraine began running into recruitment problems during its 2023 offensive. When that stalled out, the national sentiment of Ukraine started to peter out as well, because things just weren't looking as good, and it's harder to recruit when people are losing their lives not gaining ground, as compared to relatively few casualties and rapid advances on the ground. There is some irony, of course, to that. From a national perspective, the situation is much more concerning for Ukraine overall now than it was during the fall 2022 counteroffensives. But when you're looking at this at the individual level, individuals are going to be concerned about their own livelihoods, and if they see more risks associated with signing up now than they did, say, 2 years ago, then clearly you're going to have stronger recruitment incentives 2 years ago and weaker recruitment incentives right now. There's also the problem that people in Western Ukraine no longer see the war as threatening them, that currently what's happening is a battle of territory in the east, and they are no longer under threat like they were in February 2022, when there was a legitimate threat against the capital of Kyiv. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing the effects of this with large numbers of soldiers going AWOL during and after training, never mind the problem with actually getting would-be soldiers to training in the first place. The solution here, and I know that this is going to sound stupid and obvious, and I also promise you that we're going to get into more complicated strategic logic with some of these other concerns later on, so bear with me. But for now, the solution to resolving Ukrainian recruitment problems is to win something. And that is part of the reason why the Kursk offensive began 6 months ago. It allowed Ukraine to rack up some victories, even if there was territory being lost in the east. There's still something that Kyiv could point to say, we are fighting effective, we're not doing as well as what we should be doing perhaps in the east, but we do maintain offensive capacity, and we can win something somewhere. Perhaps some more actionable advice for the West is to start increasing its aid shipments to Ukraine. Part of what's going on with the morale problem is that Ukrainian soldiers, or would-be soldiers, think to themselves that they're not being given adequate support in terms of their equipment. And if they had better equipment, they would be more likely to survive in battle and make good progress. So if they got that sort of support from the West, they would be more inclined to sign up in the first place. What is interesting here is that we're seeing a bit of a chicken or the egg problem, where inside of Ukraine, there are complaints that the West is not providing aid, and that is causing problems with recruitment. And in the West, you're seeing complaints that there isn't enough recruitment inside of Ukraine to justify aid allocations to Ukraine. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it does make sense. Aid and recruitment are complementary. If you have one without the other, you're probably not going to get very far. Aid without troops, that doesn't work because you need the troops to actually use it. Troops without the aid, they're not very well armed, so they're not going to be able to do very much. You put them together, though, there is a multiplicative effect, and that is where Ukraine might start to be able to make serious progress. For now, though, it seems that both sides are content with passing the buck to the other side and blaming the other side for being the holdup. That Ukraine is suggesting, we are perfectly happy to start recruiting in large numbers, but we need the West to pick up their end first, and the West to say, we are perfectly happy, perhaps at least some countries are, to provide immense aid, but we need to see that Ukraine is actually recruiting to justify that expense. What it may take to break that stalemate is one side just saying, all right, fine, look, we're just going to do this. Whether it's the West providing tons of aid and saying, hey, now the ball is in your court, Ukraine, put up or shut up, or vice versa, where Ukraine just massively recruits, pays the political costs associated with doing so, and says to the West, again, it's time for you to put up or shut up. We've done our half of it. Now you need to do yours. That takes care of Ukrainian recruitment. Now let's go to Ukrainian training, the step that occurs after a particular recruit has signed on. Here I'm focusing more on a general dilemma that Ukraine faces, rather than something specifically that Ukraine did and failed to do properly, which then caused obvious problems on the front line. And this is a general dilemma that, again, not only Ukraine is going to be facing, but Russia is facing right now, and indeed any country that tries to recruit in the middle of a war and then train soldiers in the middle of a war will face. The simple trade-off is that the more that you train a soldier, the better that soldier is going to be when that soldier is sent out to the front line. But the longer you have to wait to send the soldier out to the front line, which means the longer it takes for you to get the fruits of the labor and the investment that you have made into that soldier's training. And when you're in the middle of a war, obviously there is a temptation to get those soldiers out as quickly as possible, given the pressing concerns that are on the front line. The advantage that Ukraine has during this period of the war is that being on the defensive is easier to do. It does not require nearly as much training as compared to trying to engage in offensive operations. So at least during this particular phase of the war, it is easier for Ukraine to push soldiers through training quickly to get them on the front lines, man stations, and try to shoot individuals that are coming along from the other side as they are trying to take over the entrenchments that Ukraine currently sits in. However, that is just not as good as going through training at a deliberate pace and maximizing the effectiveness of every soldier that goes through that system. As far as a solution goes here, there's just not much that you can do beyond slowing down what's going on along the front lines, slowing the pace of Russian advances, which then makes the need for more Ukrainian troops on the front line less pressing, and thereby buys them more time inside of training. There are some things that you can do on the margins, perhaps bringing in more Western troops to handle some of the training. But at this point, a lot of Ukrainian troops are the best ones to do the training because Ukrainian troops are the only ones with experience in what we might think of as modern warfare circa the 2020s. That's about all there is relevant to say about that general dilemma. Let's transition to another general dilemma, this time how to allocate your defenses. The perennial problem that any defender has is that, broadly speaking, defenders have to move first. Opponents observe where the defenders have allocated their defenses, and then that opponent chooses where to go on the offensive and where to attack. We've discussed before that the way that you solve this problem as a defender is not to allocate defenses and entrenchments to areas that are relatively well guarded, but you want to send them to the weakest part of the front line until the weakest part of the front line matches the next weakest part of the front line, and then allocate the rest of your defenses and entrenchments to those areas until the two weakest parts of your front line match the third weakest part of your front line, and so forth until everything has been balanced out to the best of your capacity. The reason, of course, is that the attacker is going to choose the weakest spot of the front line. And so if you spend a lot of time and resources trying to reinforce parts of the front line that are not the weakest part of the front line, ultimately all of that effort is for naught because the offensive actor chooses the area that is not getting all of those reinforcements and is in fact very weak. Again, this is an area that Ukraine has not made obvious mistakes in, and we'll see that to some degree with how Russia has been conducting the offensive in a moment. But it is the type of thing that you constantly have to be vigilant about. And the way to get better at it is to improve cross-line communication to minimize points of vulnerability. It's very easy if you're sitting back in an office somewhere in Kyiv, or where I am recording this video, to say, hey, you should always put your first allocations to the weakest spot of the front line, because that is the weakest, most vulnerable spot, and so it is the most obvious place for Russia to attack. The problem, though, is that vulnerability is something that is best appreciated on the ground. It's not something that you can fully understand coming from an office. At the same time, though, relative vulnerability is not something that any one individual can understand inside one of the trenches. A person in the north might think that they're vulnerable based on what they're seeing. A person in the south might also think that they're vulnerable based on what they are seeing. Ultimately, the person in the office is the one who has to adjudicate who is right. And to some degree, that means getting people on the ground across the front line, touring the entire front line, to be able to get both perspectives themselves and see who is actually the more vulnerable individual, and then allocate the defenses accordingly. And that connects nicely to the next topic of discussion, which is Russian redeployments and how Russia is pursuing this offensive. Here, it might help to go back to what the front line looks like right now to understand what Russia has been trying. It's been known for at least half a year plus at this point that the main target for Russia is to go to Pokrovsk, and broadly speaking, there has been progress in that direction. But notably, Ukraine has not seen Russia make a beeline directly toward that city. All else equal, that would be a smart thing for Russia to pursue. Pokrovsk is a logistical hub, it's more strategically important, it has more value. But when you're Ukraine and you're deciding how to allocate your defenses, you're going to make sure that Pokrovsk is relatively well defended precisely because it is an obvious target. That's the point of vulnerability and weakness, and so that is the first thing that you should try to shore up. So instead of always choosing to launch an attack directly at Pokrovsk, instead what Russia has been doing is probing the entire extent of the front line in this general neighborhood, trying to figure out where exactly Ukraine has not adequately deployed its defenses. Again, thinking back to the point that that guy in the office is the one who has to choose how to make the allocations. In order to do that, you need to be on the ground monitoring what exactly is weak or not, and being able to get all of that information and aggregate it at that top level is relatively difficult. And in practice, you're often going to make mistakes doing that. Well, Russia is probing for those mistakes, and then hitting the points where the mistakes have been made. The upshot for Ukraine here is that at least Ukraine has done well to redeploy in response to those attacks. And so we haven't seen very many instances where Russia has made extreme rapid gains in any one particular direction. It's more that Russia pushes up against a particular area, probes, notices that there's some short-level weakness that Ukraine is going to leave open for Russia to exploit. Russia exploits it, Ukraine plugs the hole, and then we wash, rinse, and repeat. And it's the progression of that happening over the course of 7 months now or so that is allowing Russia to make the large gains. It's not a large gain happening all at once, it's a steady stream of gains that have accumulated to what we're now observing here on the screen. In terms of solutions, half of it is what we just talked about a moment ago, that Ukraine would be better off if it could fully even out all of the vulnerabilities in the front line. But the front line is always evolving, and again, getting the information on the ground is not the easiest thing to do. And absent that, there is some other thing that Ukraine can work on that might help out the situation a little bit more. I think one of the most surprising things about this war from an outsider's perspective is that there continues to be surprise happening on the battlefield, despite a proliferation of drones all over the place inside of Ukraine and in parts of Russia as well. Now, obviously, Ukraine has done the best in this regard, achieving an operational surprise by being able to go into Kursk. But more at the tactical level, Russia is taking advantage of surprise along that front line. Well, the more that Ukraine can do to mitigate that surprise, the faster that Ukraine will be able to redeploy its forces to the areas that Russia has probed and decided are the weak points that they're planning to attack. You are never going to be able to seal the entire front line, and thus the onus is on the mobile secondary to plug the holes as they come up. Problem, though, is that the mobile secondary is only as good as the intelligence given to them, and so the onus then shifts to the intelligence gathering sectors to be able to empower the mobile secondary. And speaking of probing for vulnerabilities, the next topic is Ukrainian rotations. I mentioned earlier that Ukraine, for the most part, emphasis on for the most part, has done well to not have Russia get substantial gains all at once. That all of this has been piecemeal, and it's been the slow accumulation of gains that is broadly driving the changes in the lines on the maps. However, that has not been universally the case, and there are situations where Ukraine has rapidly lost decent chunks of territory, and a lot of that is due to failed rotations. Rotations are a necessary part of fighting any sort of war of attrition with a long line of control. You can't have the same troops constantly manning the lines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It isn't even a good idea to have frontline soldiers on the front line proper for many hours at a time. There's only so much mental energy that humans have, and when they are put to the stresses of being on the front line, that is going to be depleted relatively rapidly, and when they are out of that mental energy, they're essentially sitting ducks to the other side. Then you have more basic needs like staying warm in the winter or staying cool during the summer, eating the number of calories that you need to eat to be able to be on the front lines. That's going to be exhausting work from a physical perspective as well, so you have to eat a lot of food. And oh yeah, you also have to sleep, because if you are falling asleep on the front lines, that's a big problem not only for yourself, but for everyone around you. All of that is to say that ideally you want to have a constant system of rotation, so that you're having fresh troops replacing those that have been mentally taxed or physically taxed for a long period of time. Some of that is going to be done at a relatively local level, where you're pulling the troops at the front part of the front line to a little bit further back, where they may still be the target of small arms fire and are definitely within artillery range, but are not having to be 100% on every single moment of that period of time, thereby giving them some level of recovery period. But you also want to have a deeper rotation where they're being pulled off of the front lines fully. And that is where the problems have arisen for Ukraine along the Eastern Front right now. The fact is that it is just not easy to rotate troops. If you have a visualization of war from video games, where you get these nice heads-up displays that include a radar of not only where you are, but where all of your friendly soldiers are, and perhaps where all of the other enemy soldiers are, that's much easier to get a rotation to go through. When you see that troops are coming from over there, you know that they are your troops, so there's no reason to fire on them. In real life, though, you don't necessarily know that those are friendly troops. You might think that they're friendly troops, perhaps because you've been communicating with them that those are the friendly troops. But keep in mind that communications are not going to happen at the every individual soldier level. They're going to happen at a level higher than that. And then the communication filtering down is going to be a problem going in both directions. Some of the incoming soldiers are going to be spread out because they don't want to be an obvious and easy target for Russian soldiers who might be in the area. Well, that means that you might have a group that's slightly askew from where you're anticipating that the soldiers are coming in from. So even if you've been communicated before that there's a tree line over there that your soldiers are coming in from, if there's a tree line slightly further to the west and you're seeing movements there as well, you can't necessarily be confident that it's your troops and not Russian troops. Likewise, the incoming troops might have a general idea about what your position looks like, but are not going to know where every single soldier around you is currently positioned. As a result, rotations are among the most dangerous times for you in a defensive position. If you have a Russian attack occurring concurrently with the rotation, you're going to be in a situation where the Russian troops might get very close to you before you realize that they are Russian troops, and you are going to then be vulnerable to that offensive action from Russia. Same goes when you're trying to get either rotations or replenishments during an active firefight. It is not going to necessarily be obvious that you are not shooting at your own soldiers, which means that sometimes you are going to end up in friendly fire situations, and then other times you are not going to be firing when you should have been firing because in fact they were Russian soldiers that were coming toward you. Now, you might think that the solution to this problem is to have the soldiers currently on the front line rotate out before the next set of soldiers rotate in to replace them. It is true that solves the friendly fire problem. Any soldiers way off in the distance have to be Russian soldiers if all of your own soldiers have already left and you as the new group are coming in. However, remember, we are in a world where drones are everywhere, and as a result, it is likely the case that when you rotate out, there is going to be a drone somewhere up above that is monitoring the situation and observing the fact that you are rotating. As a result, if you vacate a position without anyone there to replace you, and the other side is observing this, then congratulations, you've just conceded that territory. And indeed, some of the worst losses that Ukraine has suffered during this offensive is precisely due to this, where there was no fight at all for that particular piece of territory. Russia just took it because Ukraine vacated it during a rotation without anyone already there to replace the troops that were leaving. And this is worse for Ukraine than it seems, because remember, the strategy at some level from Kyiv with this offensive is to concede territory for Russian casualties. And when you just let Russia take territory without suffering any casualties, not only is Russia moving the lines on maps, you're also giving it to them without any cost, and it's the cost that is allowing you as Ukraine, perhaps, to be able to turn the tide of the war eventually, or at least force Russia to stop at some point. Meanwhile, if you do a rotation properly, waiting for the next set of troops to come in before you vacate, it is still possible that the other side is monitoring this, and will use that as an opportunity to attack, because again, trying to execute a rotation requires quite a bit of coordination, which is not the easiest thing to do. However, it's not as easy from the Russian perspective to take advantage of the coordination problems as compared to take territory that is left completely unguarded. In terms of solutions, this is just something that has to be learned during training. I mentioned before that it is easier to train fresh recruits on how to play defense than it is to play offense. This is one of those things that has to be learned while they are in training. At some level, earlier on during the offensive, it is possible that this just was not getting instilled in training among Ukrainian recruits. And due to the accumulation of these problems along the Eastern Front, perhaps that has been revised in the training, and so we're not going to see these problems occurring as rapidly or as frequently as before. And indeed, that seems to be the case. We don't have as many instances of this happening recently as we did earlier on during the offensive. So it is possible here that Ukraine has learned from its mistakes about how to conduct a rotation properly. Now let's rotate the conversation to tree lines. You ask yourself, why is Russia attacking Pokrovsk? It's not just because the city is a logistical hub, or at least previously was a logistical hub. There's also something tactical about advancing in that direction, namely tree lines. And just as I said that, I realize that the image that we've been looking at the entire time is a perfect representation for what's going on here. You can see trees in the background there. You can also see the shadows of trees in the foreground. Lots of Ukraine looks like this, where you have some level of farmland and then lines of trees that go in between. Those trees have been planted at various times for purposes of protecting the farmland. But for now, what it instead is doing is protecting soldiers as they are advancing from point A to point B. This is true in the area going from Donetsk to Pokrovsk. The basic plan of attack for Russia is to hit the one tree line, take care of it, capture it, secure it, then look at the next tree line over, put some cavalry fire on it, put some artillery fire on it, capture that tree line, and advance from tree line to tree line until you get all the way to the target city. And it makes sense because the tree lines provide cover. Well, the solution to this problem then is to get rid of the tree lines. And Ukraine has done a couple of things with that, one actively and one passively by just waiting around. The active measures we saw toward the fall of last year, there were these dragon drones which would essentially fly over the tree lines and light them on fire. Bear in mind, this was not just to attack positions that Russia was currently entrenched in. It was also to cover tree lines that Russia might want to advance to. If you deny Russia the cover of the next tree line, then that would make it more difficult for Russia to advance to that next tree line. The other half of it is the calendar turning to winter. When it gets cold, the leaves tend to fall off of trees, and the less dense the foliage is, the less cover that a tree line is going to provide. And that ties into this figure that we saw from earlier. Russia's advance peaked in November of 2024, it fell off in December, and increased a little bit in January, but nowhere near the November 2024 level. The mystery is whether the winter weather is causing that drop-off. The absence of coverage in tree lines from foliage making it more difficult for Russia to advance. If that is the case, this is somewhat problematic from Ukraine's perspective. It shows that the drop-off in Russian gains is fleeting. It's only a consequence of the winter season. And indeed, it is possible that some sort of baseline level of Russian capacity has actually increased from month to month, going from November to December, as well as December to January. And the only reason we don't observe that here is that it is masked by the tree lines becoming more barren, among other things going on with winter. If that is true, then Russia will be in prime position to start making much larger gains, even larger than what we saw in November of 2024, come the spring of 2025. In contrast, from the Ukrainian perspective, the more optimistic interpretation of this graph is that winter has basically nothing to do with what we observed in the drop-off from November to December, and instead it's just some underlying capacity of Russia declining, or alternatively, Ukraine's tactical capacity increasing, that is causing that drop-off. And the difference between December and January might just be statistical noise, and maybe over the course of a few more months, those advances by Ukrainian tactics, not advances in territory, but advances in the ability to defend territory from Ukraine's perspective, that's going to go up, Russia's capacity is going to go down, and then this offensive peters out. That is the end of our discussion of tree lines. And the next topic is going to be rather short. It's going to be on Ukrainian fortifications. And it's not because this one is unimportant. In fact, it is extremely important. The reason, though, I want to keep this short is because I'm going to focus my next video on my main channel as a deep dive into Ukrainian fortifications along the Eastern Front. The short overview is that when Russia retreated from Kherson in November of 2022, it spent the next few months developing a strong front line to defend against a Ukrainian attack. And indeed, when Ukraine went on the offensive in the spring and summer of 2023, for the most part, the Russian fortifications held strong, and Ukraine was unable to make serious advances. Meanwhile, because Ukraine invested so much into the offensive, it did not spend nearly enough in terms of resources in building its own defensive line. And what we've been seeing over the last year is Russia exploiting that fact. The solution to this problem, of course, is to pick a spot and start building a line. That's easier said than done, like a lot of these things, though, because you actually have to choose a location. There's some risks associated with getting close to the current front line as being the place to build your main fortifications, versus a safer, further back distance, which risks conceding more territory to Russia. There's also the fact that it requires lots of labor to do that, and where is Ukraine going to supply that labor is another important question. Regardless, a strong front line is critical for Ukraine's bargaining position in any sort of ceasefire talk. And this is something that really has started to bug me over the last month or so. The conversation about how after a ceasefire is signed, at that point Ukraine is going to start working up on fortifications that would make it difficult for Russia to overturn the ceasefire and restart the war and try to take more territory. This is getting the timing of the situation flipped if Ukraine wants to be in a good bargaining position. That is to say, if the timing of it is ceasefire, then fortifications, the bargaining position that Ukraine will have going into the ceasefire negotiations is horrible and will be reflected by what Ukraine is able to get out of those ceasefire negotiations. Instead, the order of operations should be Ukraine building a strong fortification line, then entering negotiations, and using that fortification line to be able to exert leverage in those negotiations. And if those ceasefire negotiations never happen, well, you need a fortification line one way or another for the actual battle, so you might as well get started doing it now and not wait until later. Our penultimate topic of discussion is the ammo discrepancy. Simply put, the West is not providing enough military aid fast enough for Ukraine. The good news for Ukraine is that the Russian rate of fire appears to be slowing down over time, which means the discrepancy is not as noticeable today as it was, say, 6 months ago, which may once again play into why we have seen a drop-off in Russian advances going from November to December of 2024. Clearly, the solution here is for more aid to be sent over, but again, that's easier said than done. There's a lot of finger-pointing that goes on in the West, with Europe telling the United States that the United States needs to start doing more. Essentially, during the Biden administration, the Republicans in Congress holding up the aid, that needs to get resolved. And then alternatively, later on, toward the end of the Biden administration not taking the funds that had been allocated to this and actually using them to get this aid sent over to Ukraine. And then now with the Trump administration coming into office, the Trump administration not having a serious conversation about the future of Ukraine, at least as of yet. We will see where that goes. That is something that is definitely up in the air right now. Meanwhile, you have the Trump administration frustrated by the level of defense spending in Europe, saying that Europe needs to be spending more because this is a problem that is going on in Europe, and thus Europe is going to be internalizing the vast majority of the consequences that come out of whatever goes on between Ukraine and Russia. The only bright spot for Ukraine here is that if Trump decides to fully align himself to Ukraine and massively spike aid, he will at least have the allegiance of Republicans in Congress to make the budget problems with that suddenly disappear. As usual, we will wait and see. But that takes us to the final topic for today, the Kursk Gambit, which is probably the most complicated one, and that's why I've saved it for the end. Look, this is still a question mark even 6 months later. Yes, it has been more than a half a year since Ukraine invaded Russia, and Russia during that time remains unable to repel Ukraine, to force Ukraine out of the Kursk Oblast, despite having maybe 80,000 troops deployed to that region, many of which came from the eastern section of Ukraine, and also having thousands of North Korean troops also called in to help resolve the problem. Part of Ukraine's stated intention of the Kursk incursion was to force more troops out of eastern Ukraine, thereby relaxing what was going on with that offensive. And if you look at what happened in that 6-month period, there are questions about whether that was actually effective or not, given that the increases over the first 3 months show that, well, there was still progress being made on the Russian half. And again, think what you want to think about what's going on with the winter months. So if the question being asked is, did it stop the Russian offensive? The answer is clearly no. However, that is not the right question to ask. The question to ask is what would have happened in the absence of the Kursk offensive, and that is something that this figure cannot actually show us. It certainly has been a political problem for the Kremlin, and it's been very annoying for military planners in Russia. Even as I am recording this, it appears that Ukraine is on another offensive inside of the region of Kursk, still going west to east, which is interesting because simultaneously on the other side of the salient, Russia is trying to attack west to east as well. So you essentially have the entire front shifting eastward. Question is whether Ukraine is going to be picking up more territory than it loses in the meantime. And I think that tells us something about how to interpret these numbers here. You have a set of Ukrainian troops who are just better at conducting offensive operations than a second set of Ukrainian troops that are left to handle the defense instead. And it is true, perhaps, that those offensively minded individuals may just be better soldiers overall, and as a result, if you tasked them for defense, they might do a better job at defending Ukrainian territory in the east. That being the case, these numbers would be smaller if the Kursk troops were deployed to Donetsk and elsewhere instead in the east. Nevertheless, it is not obvious that would be the right thing to do from Ukraine's perspective. Every soldier who is offensively minded and then takes a casualty inside of a defensive entrenchment in the east was not actually maximizing their military value. If you think perhaps that the Kursk offensive is doing things politically inside of Russia that are beneficial to having there be problems inside of the Kremlin that force the Kremlin to think twice about continuing the war to the extent that is going on currently, then perhaps again it's better for those offensively minded individuals to be inside of Kursk. Similarly, if you think that a ceasefire is happening soon, the Kremlin is not going to want to have parts of the Kursk Oblast stay within Ukrainian custody afterward. So there's going to be some sort of territorial swap between the two. And if that is the case, and imagining just for a moment that it's 1-to-1, who knows what the ratio will actually be when they sit down to draw up the ceasefire plans. But imagine just for a moment that it's 1-to-1. If it's the case that the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk who are offensively minded are able to take more kilometers than they would have saved in the east, then in the long-run trade of what a ceasefire negotiation is going to look like, the Kursk Gambit pays off. And thus we are left with another question mark of the 10 reasons why Ukraine has been losing territory in the east. Now I know what you're thinking. 10. That is a large number. Do you know what number is smaller than 10? 2. As in the number of books that I have about the war. You can check the video description for more information about them. They are great. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.